Socialism is a transitionary period between capitalism and communism. Historically, this transition period has only occurred in war-torn countries that were either freshly out of feudalism or semi-feudal and had just thrown off their colonial shackles. That's what we call a tight spot. They had to figure out how to both develop their productive forces and redistribute land without going into another civil war and set up socialist institutions in the process. That's pretty damn difficult. Because every society's starting point on the socialist journey is different, there's no one-size-fits-all definition of what socialism looks like. In most cases, we're not even looking for a straight line where you constantly have less and less capitalism and more communism. There are times in which you genuinely have to take one step back so you can then take 2 steps forward. But of course, at the same time, there are markers and baselines we can set. If not, we could call anything socialism. We're essentially looking for a general direction. Do policies as a totality move society towards communism or back towards capitalism? What's the vision for where the country needs to go? And what's the plan for getting there? The ultra-left position on socialism says, phase out commodity production, meaning production for profit instead of needs, right away, and don't you dare look at material conditions. It's time to go, 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 go! This line leads to commandism, which is a type of leadership where you force people to do things they don't want. The type of leadership we're looking for is called the mass line. This means you take people's current concerns, short-term goals, and put it in a revolutionary framework, the long-term goal of liberation. Phasing out commodity production, unfortunately, isn't everyone's immediate concern. So if you push this onto people, it will lead to resentment and take away support for the revolution. The ultra-right position says that socialism is all about developing the productive forces. Because of this over-focus, unnecessary concessions are made. Why? Because capitalism tends to develop productive forces quicker because it does so unevenly. This would lead to either the development of capitalist social relations or the return to them. Now, of course, if there are unnecessary concessions, that means that there are necessary concessions. The red line poses that developing the productive forces is important, but that politics should always be in command. And that even when you have concessions you need to make, you need to be able to explain why and how this will strengthen the revolution in the long run, other than just saying, don't worry about it, it's always good to develop productive forces. In this video, we'll find out that developing the relations of production, for example, more equality, will actually unleash higher productive forces, for example, all the infrastructure built during the Great Leap Forward. If you have no idea what any of this means, don't worry, we're gonna break all of this down for you. Just keep watching. Now, all of this is still vague, but because there's so much mystique around the question of socialism, we have to be careful with how we frame it. And throughout this video, keep that ultra-left and ultra-right position in your mind. The Maoist position is that China's socialist era lasted roughly from 1956 to 1976. There's a lot of debate ongoing about whether China is socialist right now, but we can't understand the present if we don't understand the past. So this video is purely gonna cover China's revolutionary history from 1949 to 1976. It's also only gonna focus on the countryside and the non-minority areas. Similar revolutionary heights were reached in minority areas and the cities as well, but you know, the video is already long enough as it is, so sit back, enjoy, and if you need to, watch this video in parts and revisit whichever ones you like. Woo! It's gonna be a hell of a ride! When the CCP took power of the whole country in 1949, landlords still owned the majority of arable land, which means land that actually grows stuff. They comprise 3% of the population and own 26% of the best land around. This was a big problem because it was hard to grow anything in huge parts of the country. To put it in context, in 1946, the Statistical Bureau of the Kuomintang, which was the government at the time, stated that China had only 8% of its total land under cultivation. And this was actually shrinking because of erosion, mismanagement, and other environmental reasons. Not a great place to start off a revolution in which you're trying to feed everybody. As should come as no surprise, landlords were an enormous parasite on the Chinese economy. Over 50% of all crops went to landlords for rent, and more than half of Chinese farmers were tenants. What made things even more complicated was that most peasants saw their landlords as untouchable. So much so that it was hard for cadres to convince peasants to act against their landlords, even while the CCP was in power. So of course it makes sense that the starting point of the revolution would be land reform. The pace of the land reform movement differed per part of the country, and in how far and deep it went. So keep this in mind that from the get-go, the country was facing uneven development in reaching its revolutionary goals. But one thing would remain the same for all campaigns to come. The masses had to be on the front lines and enact the campaigns themselves. This meant that they had to be mobilized and then encouraged to act. The land reform movement had to cure the ills of both feudalism and colonialism, which are some gnarly isms to get rid of. This is a big project, so the era of land reform consisted of multiple smaller campaigns. One of these was the anti-trader movement, in which collaborators with the Japanese were subjected to people's courts. In many places, this was the first time peasants had been mobilized to attack people who used to be their superiors, a pretty important thing in a revolution. Let's take a look at a struggle session that took place in Longbo, a village in Shensi province. The first session was against the trader Guo, a former puppet village head under the Japanese. The cadre started the session by recalling all the horrible things he'd done. He had ratted on people for the Japanese, which had led to their torture and killing. He had also grafted grain from the peasants, which aggravated the famines they were facing on a yearly basis already. A cadre leading the session started to speak, in an attempt to arouse the masses.
In the past, we were despised. Only now could we hold our heads up high and speak like men. Look, the village is ours.
He swept his arm in a wide arc. China belonged to the people now, but the masses had to feel it in order to act on it. If not, holding power was meaningless. Communism can only be achieved once every single person feels empowered to help construct it. The cadre continued.
Come now, who has evidence against this man?
Silence. The new vice chairman of the village, Guangzhou, a peasant, couldn't take it anymore and stood up.
Tell the people how much you stole.
And he hit Guo. Everyone gasped. No peasant had hit an official like that before. This shocked the audience and changed something in them. But the change was small and temporary because they were still a passive audience. Revolution requires the active engagement of the masses. After the failed struggle session, the cadres had small meetings with the peasant families and found out that what was holding them back was fear. They realized they could only mobilize the people slowly and in concentric circles like the waves on the surface of a pond when a stone is thrown in. The stone in this case were the cadres. The meeting the next day started out better but ended up with just a small crowd of young men who just wanted to beat the trader up and get it over with. Which, one, makes sense, because remember, this man was responsible for the brutal murder of their family members during Japanese occupation. But what was more important is that this would have only mobilized a small group and would have left most peasants in a passive position. Now right now you might be wondering, alright Space, if we have such a long road ahead, why are we going into such detail for this one episode? That's because the process of making revolution is learned through painstaking practice. We can only grasp the universal concept of socialism by wielding its particular practices. And it was in these early campaigns that cadres and peasants learned how to fully mobilize and embody the revolution. And we can see that most clearly in the campaign following the anti-trader movement, which was the one against landlords. This time, it wasn't the cadres who led the struggle against the landlords. Instead, they first organized the local peasants association and then agitated the people in the organization to take action. This was the only organization authorized to lead the struggle against the landlords on a national scale, and it was comprised of, you guessed it, local peasants. Their responsibilities included struggling against landlords, receiving confiscated property, and distributing it to the landless and land poor. Let's take a look at how this went down in the same village, Longbo. The poorest peasants in the village were called together. Tianming, a cadre, started off the session asking who lives off whom. Each member had to tell their own life story and figure out for themselves what the root of the problem was. Story after story followed. Then a poor peasant woman responded.
Landlords forced you to sell your house, but my parents had to sell me. We lived in a prosperous valley, but we owned no land. In the famine year, we were starving, and my parents sold me for a few bushels of grain. If we had some land, I could have found a husband and had been properly married. Instead, I was sold like a donkey or a cow.
Village cadres kept asking, what's the reason for this? Was it supernatural forces that determine our fate, or was it the land system and the rents we had to pay? Why shouldn't we now take on the landlords and right the wrongs of the past? The families wanted to, but said there weren't enough people to stand up against them. The cadre then urged them to unite with more families. Soon over 100 families joined. These were then followed by more meetings and careful preparations for the big struggle session. People with the most serious grievances were first encouraged to speak up during small meetings to build up their confidence, and only then were they mobilized to speak out at the village-wide meeting. And when everybody was ready, the struggle sessions against the landlords started. The first landlord who was struggled against was Guo Chunwang. His tenants had died of starvation during the famine year, while he had seized grain and hoarded it for speculation. Before the start of the session, the militia uncovered the grain which he had hoarded, and most of it was rotten. It could have saved many lives. They threw it all over the courtyard, and the people stood there, smelling the class contradiction. They confronted him and told him,
"We had nothing to eat, but you had no thought for us. You watched us starve without pity."
One year I couldn't pay the rent. You took the whole harvest. My clothes. You took everything.
Miao Lin, his brother died.
Make him talk. Let's hear his answers.
The landlord couldn't answer and lowered his gaze. This moment was so important. The masses saw this powerful figure who had nothing to say for himself. And from this point on, many who had been afraid to open their mouths found themselves shouting in anger without thought of consequences. Many meetings followed, and when the punishment was decided, the masses dished out the consequences themselves. It's important here to note that despite all the memes, death was only meted out for the harshest cases. Trust, there were a lot of landlords left around to make trouble during socialist construction. The slogan for campaigns was, "The peasant must be educated into socialism." The peasantry had to denounce its own exploitation and rise up against the landlords. This was both an education in politics and also practical political change. Or, in revolutionary terms, a twofer-doofer. So this seems simple enough, right? The party guides cadres, and the cadres then guide the masses. The masses then guide the cadres and the party, who then begin the process again, but from a higher level of understanding and practice. If there's a party to lead class struggle and make sure the masses are mobilized and take it on as their own, you can reach communism. But there's one little problem. A party will never be completely unified. You will always have line struggle representing different class interests within the party. There's a bourgeois faction, which I might refer to as headquarters sometimes, and a proletarian faction. These are in constant struggle with each other. But what's important to note is that both sides are saying they want to reach communism and that their policies are the way to go. So how did this play out during the land reform campaign? Let's start with the bourgeois faction. This faction was led by Liu Shaoqi, who was the vice president at this time amongst many other positions. To start things off, they didn't want to abolish landlordism, but wanted a reduction of rent in kind. They were saying that the land reform was too aggressive. Think of the poor landlords. They emphasized the 4 freedoms: freedom to buy and sell land, freedom to hire tenants, freedom to select crops to plant, and free markets and pricing. Just leave the free market to do its thing and prosperity will come to all. Sound familiar? This was never an official policy, but did circulate at cadre level and messed with the effectiveness of land reform. Liu Shaoqi also said,
"There should be no requisitioning of surplus land. This is a long-term policy. Only when conditions are mature for extensive application of mechanized farming will rich peasant economy cease, which will be a long time."
This line puts productive forces first. I'm gonna get into what this means in the next section, but for now you can kind of see it like this. China's poor. China doesn't have the technology needed to produce a lot of food. If we develop capitalism and make rich peasants even richer, technology will continue to develop, food production will increase, and then we'll have a technological basis for socialism to develop. This was opposed by the proletarian faction led by Mao. They said, class struggle is primary over productive forces. There's no need to indefinitely continue the 4 freedoms because the masses are already ready to complete land reform. Not only that, but we need to complete this quickly so we can build the basis for socialism. I mean, land reform's just the first step. After that, we're going to completely reorganize society by socializing agriculture step by step. When one building block is placed, the next one has to be in line right away, cautiously, not rushing, but actively. The bourgeois faction did see this as rushing the peasants. So essentially, we see two contradictions at play here, one between the primacy of productive forces and primacy of class struggle, but also a contradiction between, on the one hand, a continuous deepening of revolution, and on the other, consolidating gains. These contradictions are going to remain throughout the party's history, and at all levels of it. In 1952, after the completion of land reform, socialism was far from guaranteed. As a matter of fact, had the party not stepped in, China would have simply developed capitalism. Think about it, 300 million poor and landless peasants had finally obtained land, which was great, but it was hard for the peasants to benefit from this because there were either no tools available or the richer peasants were hoarding them. Aside from that, the plots were small and the soil was in horrible shape. And not to mention drought and floods. So what to do? It wasn't like they were able to just go to a rural bank to get a loan. So the peasants having their own land meant that there was a break from feudalism. But due to the tough spot most people were in, any small mishap forced them to just sell their lands and hire themselves out to peasants with better land and better tools, which was allowed and even supported by the four freedoms. So no cooperation, just the deepening of good old wage labor. Not a good prospect. And this was happening at a crazy pace. In one area between 1953 and 1954, 800 peasant families out of 5,000 sold their new land. Just one unexpected death in the family could force them in debt, and then it was game over. This didn't mean the four freedoms were inherently bad. I mean, after all, had the party ignored the material conditions and just pushed for collectivization while most peasants barely had any tools, then they would have had a peasant uprising on their hands. Alright, so if the problem is that peasants don't have farm tools and equipment, then just produce them, bro. What's the issue here? You see, if they would have simply focused on this production without changing the social structure, then inequality would have kept rising, and it would have been mostly rich peasants who would have benefited from this. In short, you can't socialize production without production. Again, most of the country at this time was in desperate poverty. But if all you focus on is production and not socialization, then how can you reach socialism? There would have to be the right balance between developing productive forces and transforming social relations, and different factions in the party had different answers on how to go about this. If China was going to develop socialism, there needed to be a counterpole to the four freedoms, a way to keep budding capitalist relations in check and to already start collectivizing the countryside. Cause I'll tell you, it really says something about the danger and mystical allure of capital, how quickly and wildly capitalist practices developed all over the country. As a matter of fact, 1952, the big year that marked the defeat of feudalism, was also the year of the golden age of the free market and speculation in China. It was like a game of whack-a-mole where feudalism was knocked down and capitalism started to pop up right away. Capitalist ideology started to infiltrate the thinking of peasants immediately. A lot of families had their own 5-year plan to get rich. Work hard in the first year, save and buy seeds and tools so that the second year they could afford a draft animal who'd help plow fields and carry heavy loads. With the animal, they hoped to earn enough in the third year to buy more land. Then in the fourth year, employ wage labor by hiring an extra hand, and so on. This frustrated a lot of poor peasants and cadres enormously. Chen Yonggui, a cadre from Dajai, described it like this.
In 1952, speculation was rampant. A person could buy cotton in Hebei province and then sell it in Shanxi province. Then buy things in Shanxi province and sell it in Hebei province.
Ex-landlords and rich peasants who had capital would show off by sitting outside their doors eating noodles, which was an expensive dish at the time. They dangled them enticingly from chopsticks. They were saying, look, all these plans for collectivizing are ridiculous. I'm going at it alone, and look how rich I am. But of course, this wealth was based on exploitation. Rich peasants rented out draft animals, employed wage labor, speculated, and hoarded grain. Sure, this led to quick wealth, but it did so on an unequal basis. And that makes sense, right? It's much easier for 10 people to get rich quickly than for 1,000 people to all rise together in quality of life. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands, and you catch my drift. But of course, the peasant masses didn't just sit by idly. Most of them, especially in the north, had already been sharpened through decades of class struggle. So with this increasing polarization going on, they took matters in their own hands. I mean, think about it. They'd struggled in uprisings against landlords and warlords in the 1930s, then in the war against the Japanese, then the Civil War, then against landlords in the land reform movement, and after all of this, the rich peasants were winning out. Hell no. This frustration is illustrated well by a poor peasant saying at the time, "A rich peasant is like a snake in one's pocket." The advanced sections of the masses didn't wait for the party to step in. This is a theme we'll keep seeing that went like this. The party would consolidate gains already made by the advance guard and pull in the rear guard to prepare for the next advance. This means that almost all policy change was based on things the advanced sections of the peasantry were already doing. For example, as early as 1951, poor peasants in Shensi province were already banding together to form co-ops without directives from the party. One thing that set Mao apart from the rest of communist leadership was that he constantly toured the countryside on the lookout for these types of advanced moves. These were then turned into templates for the whole country. After these spontaneous co-ops, for example, Mao adopted draft decisions on mutual aid and cooperation in agricultural production in December of 1951. Damn, that's a long name. This urged everybody to start setting up mutual aid teams and elementary co-ops. But this directive didn't come out of thin air. It was simply expanding on what was already there. By the time this draft was implemented, there were already millions of mutual aid teams and 500 elementary co-ops. But these were different than the mutual aid teams and co-ops of today. Let's get deeper into it. In mutual aid teams, members shared productive instruments like draft animals, hoes, carts, etc., and their labor power with one another to increase production. This was the first step to collectivization, beneficial to the peasants, and most of all, it was a safe move. This was like a testing grounds of some sort. Let's see how it feels to labor together and share production tools. But if it feels like it isn't working, I still have my own stuff to get back to. Everything was still owned by individuals who chose to share what they had. Of course, this wasn't just an economic decision, it was a political training ground as well. Remember, the masses are educated into socialism. Mutual aid teams were no different. Their principles were voluntary participation, equal exchange of labor and value, democratic operation. Sounds like a good education into socialism to me. Now, of course, you might wonder, if there were already a lot of spontaneous mutual aid teams and elementary co-ops, why was there a need for a party directive at all? Well, whenever the party gave the stamp of approval for something the masses were already doing, there'd be a huge rush all over the country to follow lead. The masses never realized how disunified the party was until the Cultural Revolution, so it just felt like they had the complete party's backing and were all in. By January 1952, a month after the adoption of Mao's draft, 43% of the peasantry had formed mutual aid teams. But the more mutual aid teams popped up, the more their limitations became apparent. After all, it was only a super low level of cooperation. It didn't change the relationship between those who owned large amounts of productive capital and those who owned little to none. If you're a part of a mutual aid team and you owned a draft animal, you'd be more productive and better off than those who didn't, because these tools and animals weren't shared on a permanent basis. And at the scale of teams, they couldn't cope with large projects like farm management, natural disasters, initiate technical improvement of tools, organize water conservative projects, all that good stuff. All of this required larger capital investments that only rich peasants were able to supply. So it became clear that mutual aid teams needed to be elevated to elementary co-ops. The difference here was that instead of members still fully owning their tools and animals, they'd loan them out to the co-op and receive a share of output in return. It was a type of capital investment. What's more exciting is that they all managed farm production together by making decisions about production and labor allocation. This, of course, was with reference to local and national planning. After all that, they divided income among members. Sounds like they're on the right track to socialism. Just like how Mao's draft policy in 1951 caused an eruption of mutual aid teams, the same happened for co-ops. Local admins were instructed to set them up everywhere. This, however, was faced with much more resistance from the bourgeois section of the party, which I'll get to in a second. All you need to know right now is that a big section of the party was pushing for the rich peasant line, meaning to just have the rich peasants get rich first, and then the rest will follow. By the end of 1953, after much intra-party struggle, the general line finally shifted from promoting rich peasants to actively socialize agriculture. This meant a sharpening of class struggle in the party and in the countryside. Again, the bourgeois section and the rich peasants they represented didn't want this to happen, and party members were of course in a position to seriously sabotage the movement. From 1953 to 1956, a lot of co-ops got started and a lot of co-ops were disbanded. To simplify things, more co-ops were created than they were disbanded. So for example, in December 1951, you had 500 co-ops. In December 1953, there were 14,000, despite there having been a mass dissolution that year. The same mass dissolution happened in 1954, and yes, it's as bad as you'd imagine. A lot of peasant households were forced to return to individual farming. Party members gave the excuse of saying co-ops worked badly. But the more time went on, the more co-ops started to refuse the order to disband, and you had poor peasants associations resisting cadres, a nice prelude to the Cultural Revolution that would go down a decade later. A lot of cadres resisted the disbandment order as well. Just put yourself in their shoes. How frustrating to hear contradictory orders without realizing that these came from intense intra-party struggle. Start a co-op, disband a co-op, start it again. What a mess. Let's hear it from the cadres themselves. Veteran Wang, who worked in the Rural Affairs Department of Changchi, was asked to dissolve a co-op he himself had set up. When we were asked to organize co-ops, we were determined to get them running well. When higher-ups suddenly ordered us to go out and dissolve co-ops, we went out with a heavy heart, but we went. We obeyed the orders of our leaders. If anyone expressed any doubts, the response was always, "Don't you think the leadership knows better than you?" As soon as the leaders put anything before us as a Communist Party task, most of us automatically worked very hard at it. We were the sort of docile tools advocated for by Liu Shaoqi. The city committee asked Guo Chuande to take charge of liquidating the co-op and Sung family settlement that he had enthusiastically upheld, but he refused. He said, "I can't talk out of both sides of my mouth. When we set up the co-ops, I talked day and night about how good they were. Now you want me to go out and tell people to abandon them? I can't do it." Not only is this frustration apparent, it also speaks to how parts of the party ignored the mass line and were commandist. By commandism, we mean that instead of patiently convincing the peasants to implement a certain political line and genuinely listen to their concerns and adapt it to the line, you're just forcing them to do what you want. With co-ops popping up and being shut down, peasant associations resisting cadres, cadres resisting orders, and rich peasants and landlords getting richer, class struggle was on the rise. The more polarized this difference would become, the more antagonistic the solutions would have to be. But with communists in control of the state, the goal was to have socialist transition develop as peacefully as possible. Like I said, at the end of 1953, the rich peasant line was starting to be abandoned, and co-ops started popping up. The reason why this transition from a rich peasant economy to that of a socialist one was successful was due to one of the most genius policies in China's revolutionary history. The policy was the unified purchase of grain by the state, which meant a state monopoly on buying and selling of grain. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but I'm gonna explain why this was so important. You see, grain was the most important commodity in all of China, which meant that if there was anything the rich peasants and former landlords could speculate on, it was grain. And just like that, with one stroke of the pen, the power of rich peasants was curbed enormously. Sale quotas and set prices were to make it impossible to do better than others in the marketplace. But of course this didn't end class struggle. This only made the rich peasants and former landlords counterattack. And it isn't the state's job to fix problems, it's to give the tools to the masses to fix it for themselves. The state policy was a way to give more power to poor and lower middle peasants, to make sure they'd be able to struggle against rich peasants without the latter being too powerful. The state could curb exploitation, but the peasants had to eliminate it. The poor peasants were the main force and had to unite with the middle peasants to make this happen. So let's summarize all these developments. Land reform had limited profit to be made by renting out land. Mutual aid teams made it more difficult to make a profit with hired labor. Peasants who were used for hired labor simply joined mutual aid teams, and soon there was no reserved army of labor to work with. Credit co-ops and low-interest government loans were making it harder to earn money by lending money. Sale quotas and set prices were to make it impossible to do better than others in the marketplace. Rich peasants, of course, started to resist state purchases of grain, cotton, and oil at fixed prices. They made contracts directly with organizations operations in cities and set up all kinds of free market schemes. In some cases, the revenue of a few rich peasants increased faster than the total revenue of their village, and this is why heightening class struggle was so important. The peasants once more took matters into their own hands. New distinctions between upper and lower middle peasants were made. As class contradictions sharpened, a new strategy and set of class alliances had to be formed. After this was done, landlords, rich peasants, and upper middle peasants were then sifted out of peasant associations. Because not only were rich peasants speculating, they were also sabotaging the co-op movement, with of course the backing of Liu Shaoqi and his clique. And there were a lot of avenues to sabotage because these early co-ops were inexperienced and shaky. It was easy for rich peasants to encourage waste and extravagance. They said joining the co-op is like acquiring sons. One can lie down and rest. Now you have a guarantee against hunger. Aside from spreading this type of nonsense, other sabotaging methods included withdrawing draft animals or tools at times of harvest or planting. At the same time, lower-level cadres lacked drive and vision, and after getting constantly conflicting directions from different factions in the party, just ended up shrugging and not doing or promoting anything. Despite all this, the co-op still succeeded, and a lot of this had to do with the policy of the 3/3. They were led by a poor peasant, who were the main force of the revolution, then a middle peasant to supply the tools, and a Communist Party member for ideological guidance. I won't go deeper into this, but recommend reading Shenfan by William Hinton for the complete story there. All in all, by autumn 1954, there were 100,000 co-ops. The more co-ops were disbanded, the more new ones started. It was kind of crazy. For example, in 1955, 200,000 co-ops were eliminated and 550,000 new ones were formed. By mid-year 1955, there were 650,000 co-ops. These increases were partially thanks to mobilization campaigns to have peasant associations struggle harder against class enemies, but also PLA members returning to their hometowns after their return from Korea, having gone through intense ideological development and thus being strong assets for the collectivization drive. By June 1956, 91.7% of peasant households were in co-ops, and by the end of 1956, this number hit 1.3 million. And in the same year, the Constitution laid out co-op formation as a standard policy. It was official. And this is where China's socialist stage begins. After the completion of land reform in 1952, there were two contending visions for a new China. This shouldn't be surprising because, like I said before, there's always going to be two-line struggle in any party. This was even the case with land reform itself. There had been a faction in the party that wanted to transition out of feudalism slowly, while the opposing faction wanted to ride the wave of revolutionary hype to complete land reform quickly. And since feudalism was abolished in the entire nation in 3 years, you can guess what faction won out. But now with the party fully in charge and a major task complete, the difference between the two visions became more apparent. You see, the principal goals from the start of the revolution to 1952 were to establish national unity by overthrowing colonialism and feudalism. There were disagreements on how to get there, but the general consensus was that this needed to happen. After all, there's no reason why a capitalist roader, a party member who wants capitalism, would want a China divided by warlords and colonial authorities. The proletarian faction was happy with the stage the country had reached in 1952 because the masses had taken control over their own fate and were already spontaneously organizing into mutual aid teams, proving that there was plenty of communist spirit to go around. And most importantly, landlordism, which had plagued China for thousands of years, was almost fully abolished. I say almost because, contrary to popular belief, most former landlords survived and were pissed. We'll get back to that later. So now that colonialism and feudalism were abolished, the next big goal of the party was to develop the productive forces while controlling capitalism, which was rearing its ugly little head. This meant decreasing the influence of former landlords and rich peasants and promoting the formation of mutual aid teams and other small socialist forms of cooperation. In other words, as soon as China had switched from feudalism to capitalism, the proletarian faction was already trying to figure out how to abolish those capitalist forces and replace them with socialist forces. Or better yet, funnel those capitalist energies into establishing socialism. There was never a moment of pure unfettered capitalism without a push for socialism. They were constantly trying to change the relations of production and distribution from being based on the productivity of your land and the amount of tools you possessed to production and distribution that was based on how much work you did, while of course taking care of those who couldn't work. So the proletarian faction was pretty happy with the way things were going, with mutual aid teams and elementary co-ops on the rise. How about the capitalist faction of the party? Well, they were happy with the stage the country had reached in 1952 because there was a sweet little free market that was opening up. If you had the heart to engage in speculation, there was some serious money to be made. And because the Four Freedoms stated that rich peasants were allowed to exploit other peasants, there was an increase in their productivity because, you know, extracting surplus value from people increases productivity for a small group. Now with the yoke of landlordism removed, the road was cleared for surplus value extraction and capital accumulation. And in the countryside, it was the rich peasants who would lead the charge. These two visions I described obviously contradicted each other. The proletarian faction wanted to further change the social relations by deepening cooperation and promoting class struggle between poor peasants and rich peasants, while the capitalist faction just wanted to let things run their course, which would be the best way to further develop capitalism. So just like how there was class struggle in society, there was class struggle within the party. As a matter of fact, the capitalist faction in the party merely represented capitalist forces in society. This transitional stage of the early 1950s is so important because for the rest of China's socialist period, this is the era the capitalist faction wanted to go back to, and what they'll eventually achieve starting from 78. What better representation is there of the rich peasant line than the Dengist aphorism, enrich yourselves? For us in hindsight, it's fairly easy to pick out who the capitalist roaders were, but at the time it was more difficult because they never announced themselves as such. They used Marxist language and in the Chinese context had to quote Mao to get a hearing from the people. They essentially used Mao against Mao. Instead of saying, we want capital accumulation and capitalist social relations in the countryside with rich peasants exploiting poor peasants, they said,
listen, China's in bad shape. And before we can think about all that socialist gabagooby, we need to develop the productive forces. How can we think of socialism when we can't produce enough food to eat?
This was of course ridiculous because it was socialism that was guaranteeing enough food for everyone to go around. But anyway. As early as 1950, Liu Shaoqi, who headed the bourgeois headquarters, said that only after mechanized farming were collective farms and socialist reform possible. And to achieve mechanized farming, you needed to have a rich peasant economy. Then industry would reach a certain level of conditions and voila, it'd be socialism time. What that certain level would be was of course never specified. Mao, who led the proletarian headquarters, said, look, we do need a period of capitalist development, but this is to achieve very specific goals, namely to consolidate the results of land reform and to boost initial productivity quickly. Most importantly, it needs to be led by the party, be kept in check actively, and needs to coincide with a clear plan for how this period of capitalism is going to help develop socialism. Unlike Liu, Mao had drafted up a plan for how higher and higher forms of co-ops were going to be built during the stage of capitalism. He didn't say, we're just going to let things develop until we have enough productive forces to establish socialism. He said, we're going to keep rich peasants around, but keep speculation in check, which, if you remember, had happened successfully in 1953 with the Grain Purchasing Act. Aside from holding back rich peasants, we're going to keep arousing poor and middle peasants to form more co-ops, set quotas, and develop a general line. So we can summarize the two visions presented as mechanization before collectivization, Liu, collectivization before mechanization, Mao. Liu's would further develop capitalism, Mao's socialism. Liu emphasized productive forces, Mao emphasized politics and command, meaning changing social relations to then change production. One emphasized rich peasants, the other the poor peasants. Liu headed the bourgeois faction emphasizing productive forces. Mao headed the proletarian faction emphasizing politics in command. There's one more aspect to consider before going into what these two factions were and what they stood for. Because we're materialists, we care more about impact than intent. Surely there were genuine comrades who huddled around Liu's line of disbanding co-ops because they genuinely thought socialism could be achieved through just developing productive forces. But that's unimportant. What matters are the material effects of their political line. If we'd follow Liu's line, would we arrive at capitalism? If we'd follow Mao's line, would we arrive at socialism? You can see it as a difference between conscious revisionism and unconscious revisionism. Some comrades just didn't understand the meaning of socialist revolution, and while they thought they were engaged in socialism, it turned out they were engaging in capitalism. The next question is, why two lines? Why two-line struggle? Isn't this an oversimplification? How can it be as easy as one side wanting to completely disband co-ops and the other side wanting to promote them? Maybe some comrades just wanted the development of co-ops at a slower pace, and others just wanted more time for consolidation. Well, you see, a funny thing happens in political struggle. As class struggle gets sharper, ambiguous positions and uncertain lines start to drift towards one of two poles. At some point, when things get really heated, you have to pick a side to survive. And that's why we talk about a two-line struggle instead of a five-line struggle. Different factions of the party eventually had to make a choice which line to back, because all lines eventually would lead to one of two results. Now that this is out of the way, let's take a closer look at the concept of mechanization before collectivization. There's a lot of criticisms we can launch at this, but we can condense it to two. 1. Developing productive forces is a theory of socialism based on technology, not social relations. But what are economic systems? They are systems of social relations, how people relate to each other while they do things and make things. Capitalism is capitalism because the relations between people are based on exploitation and domination through the extraction of surplus value. Communism is communism because relations between people are based on cooperation, and distribution is based on an equal basis. Socialism is socialism because you're actively changing the social relations from one into the other. If you're not changing social relations during socialism, how is it socialism? If you promise to change the social relations sometimes in the future, but don't have a plan on getting there, how is it socialism? Developing productive forces in themselves does not change social relations, it just changes the productive forces. People might say, well, during China's capitalist transition, there was no changing of social relations, but they were still socialists. Or, how can you expect for them to change social relations if they weren't able to feed people? What are you, an idealist? Well, 1. During China's capitalist transition, they were changing relations, namely from feudalism to capitalism. And they were already starting to transform social relations by forming elementary co-ops and mutual aid teams. They were in the process of forming socialist relations while consolidating capitalist relations. Think about it. Within a time span of 4 years, they went from feudalist to capitalist to socialist. The productive forces, of course, developed during this time. But what mostly did? You guessed it, social relations. God, that was a lot of relations. I need a break. 2. Too much consolidation leads to the death of revolution. This is known as conservatism. Mao said that you've got to strike while the iron is hot. Change takes massive amounts of energy, momentum, and emotion. The forces of reaction and capitalist ideology can knock this momentum down at any second. That's why it's important to constantly push forward and deepen the revolution. Of course, there have to be periods of consolidation or retreats between periods of revolutionary advance. But if this is overdone, then consolidation turns into its opposite, which is retreat and defeat. We've seen this in every single revolution globally. So in the case of socializing agriculture, choosing speed over a gradual approach wasn't a preference, it was a necessity. Revolutions that stagnate are revolutions that deteriorate. And because globally the dominant trend ideologically is bourgeois, if you spend too much time consolidating and not driving and pushing forward socialist relations, then bourgeois ideology will win out. But of course, in the end, the speed you're going at is always determined by the mass line. We shouldn't try to advance anything before the overwhelming majority of the people are satisfied with the advance. We should always make over 90% of the people delighted. Now, this talk about the pace of revolution being determined by the mass line isn't all talk, it's really how cooperativization went down. Mao constantly went around the countryside, noted what the most advanced peasants were already accomplishing on their own, and then set that as a template for the whole country. His plans of establishing co-ops were based on material reality, not some utopian idea disconnected from the masses. The proletarian faction and the bourgeois faction were constantly struggling for the upper hand. Both had their own advantages and disadvantages. Most important of all, the proletarian faction had the backing of the masses. The line struggle between the two factions around co-ops was intense. When Liu and Gaogang, the two main leaders of the capitalist faction at the time, said co-ops were utopian pipe dreams and did everything they could to stop them. Whenever co-ops were started, they then called out to disband them. These people were huge party members. Gaogang oversaw all of Northeast China and was also head of the State Planning Commission of China. Other people who actively worked against the establishment of the co-ops were people like Bo Yibo, the Minister of Finance, and Peng Zheng, the mayor of Beijing. Again, people with major influence. How the proletarian faction won out over the bourgeois faction would sidetrack us too much. But what's important to know is that there was an intense class struggle in the party that featured high-ranking party members on both sides. This struggle had material effects because many co-ops were disbanded and cadres were sent out to sabotage the movement through methods like commandism. Ultimately, Liu's faction was temporarily defeated in 1953 when cooperation was set as the general line instead of the rich peasant line. And what happened after, we already went over. So China reached the stage of socialism around 1956, only 4 years after capitalist development had started. The proletarian faction led this transition while the country faced extreme poverty, had major global enemies hounding them externally, and a huge chunk of the party fighting against them internally. Safe to say it's beyond impressive. All this stuff is really confusing, right? You have a communist party with a proletarian faction and bourgeois faction, and then different policies being implemented, and they all claim to be socialist, and some are not, and some are. You can have a majority in the party pushing capitalist policies, but still socialism winning out. But then it's like still in danger? What's going on? Let's take a step back. Why does class struggle continue under socialism? Because there are still different classes within society that are struggling for power. And since the party is a microcosm of the society it leads, this struggle between classes is the strongest within the party. The capitalist faction drew its strength from the capitalists and aspiring capitalists within society. The strongest representation was the former landlord class and rich peasants. The proletarian faction found its support within the poor peasant base and the working class. If at this point you're wondering how people didn't see through the BS of the bourgeois faction, let me quote Liu Shaoqi himself on the topic. Although in general our party members are relatively the best Chinese men and women, the vanguard of the Chinese proletariat, they come, however, from every stratum of Chinese society, and are still living in this society which is replete with the influences of the exploiters, selfishness, intrigues, bureaucracy, and every kind of filthy thing. Is it anything strange that there are muddy stains on a person who crawls out of the mud and who constantly dabbles in the mud? Each section will thus propose projects that advance their own interests and vision for society, even though they might say things differently, like we just heard from our pal Yu. Pao Yuqing, a Chinese economist, calls these different interests capitalist and socialist projects. The goal of capitalist projects is to move society towards capitalism. These projects do so by enlarging capital accumulation and value valorization, which just means producing for exchange value and then actually banking on the profit. The goal of capitalist projects is to remove workers from having any control over the means of production and products of their labor. When capitalist projects expand, capital accumulation is sped up by extracting more surplus value from workers. Opposed to capitalist projects are socialist projects, whose direction is towards communism, where direct producers have control over the means of production and products of their labor. Under socialist projects, distribution happens according to the amount of labor contributed while making sure the basic needs of all people are met. As productive forces develop further and social relations are made more and more equal, distribution will then happen according to everyone's need. In short, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Socialist projects are designed to restrain, contain, and interrupt the accumulation of state and/or private capital. During a transition, capitalist projects and socialist projects will continually struggle it out. To oversimplify, if all you implement are socialist projects, you reach communism. If all you implement are capitalist projects, you reach capitalism. Enough abstract theory, let's get back to concrete history and see what kind of projects have been implemented in China up till 1956. Remember, these were land reform, mutual aid teams, and elementary co-ops. Land reform in and of itself was a capitalist project. Think about it. Its main aim was to squash feudalism and unleash capitalist forces while containing them. Before the revolution, most surplus went to landlords who spent it on luxuries. After land reform, this surplus turned into capital accumulation. Better than feudalism, but of course still dangerous, because this produces capitalist social relations and unequal development. It may surprise you, but mutual aid teams and elementary co-ops were also capitalist projects. Why? Because under socialism, distribution is based on labor, not on capital. And in mutual aid teams, peasants might have worked together, but what they received was ultimately based on their lands and tools, aka their capital. The same goes for elementary co-ops. What peasants received was based on how much capital they'd invested in the co-ops, meaning tools and draft animals. This means they were deriving profits from capital investment, which again is not a principle of socialism. So if they were capitalist projects, why did the capitalist faction resist them so much? Because these were steps of a calculated larger socialist strategy. Because there was a proletarian faction that incorporated them into a plan to abolish capitalism. The whole point was for mutual aid teams to turn into elementary co-ops, then advanced co-ops, and then into communes. For the capitalist projects to transform into socialist projects. The capitalist rotor saw this coming, and thus had to sabotage these plans from the get-go. The reason why we say that China became socialist in 1956 is because this is when you saw a massive implementation of advanced co-ops. This was a huge deal and started a new stage in the Chinese countryside. All agricultural land was appropriated as cooperative property. The relationship between private ownership and income had mostly been abolished. Advanced co-ops essentially ended the rich peasant economy. You know, a large section of the mass base for the capitalist rotors. From this point on, labor would be the single yardstick for income. Transforming elementary co-ops into advanced co-ops was a tough process, and different classes within the peasant masses felt differently about them. The advanced sections, who mainly consisted of poor peasants, were happy with the co-ops, as it guaranteed them food and security for the first time in their lives. But there were a lot of peasants, especially from the older generations, who had a tough time grasping what was going on. This is nicely illustrated in a conversation taken from Shenfan between a lifelong hired laborer for landlords called Shisheng Mao and Guangzhou, a cadre. What are we intending to do in this co-op? Why, we intend to go to socialism in this co-op, said Guangzhou. But, said Ultra, it looks like I've gone right back into feudalism. I don't have my land anymore. My donkey works for everyone, and here I am laboring in the fields with nothing at all, just as I did in the past. It took a while for people to get adjusted to socialist principles. This wasn't an easy task, and as you can imagine, this confusion was easy for capitalist rotors to take advantage of. Because after all, that's how they pushed their program, by using weaknesses in the unity of the toiling masses. Cadres and work teams constantly had to arouse and agitate the peasants. Sinfa, a chair of a 20-family co-op, looked back at the early stage of this process. Conditions weren't like what they are now, with everything long merged and nobody able to find his own land anymore. At that time, it was just a question of each man taking his ox home and going out to work on his own plot if they wanted to quit. This highlights a stark difference between the early co-op days and later commune days. Not only does this describe an economic shift, but also an ideological shift. The next big step in the movement of advanced co-ops was for people to sell their draft animals. Turning over animals was the hardest single step of the whole cooperative process. People who possessed a good draft animal and cart considered it to be half of the family. They were emotionally attached. But after the initial hardship, people were like, hey, it's kind of nice to be home without an animal in the front room I have to feed, water, and clean up after. It also didn't hurt that once advanced co-ops started to stabilize, income quickly improved. What's important was that avenues for personal capital investments were closed, so extra earnings from individuals went to luxury items like bicycles and sewing machines. It was the co-ops that made capital investments like electric mills for grinding grain. With a bicycle, peasants could visit relatives in distant places without sitting on an animal, and with electric grain mills, they could grind grain without an animal in front of the millstone. The last step that remained after selling animals was moving the stones that marked where everyone's land was. As cadres took the lead, the masses followed. Sinfa, the co-op chair, described,
For months after we turned the land over to the co-op, we never called it our land, and the same was true of the animals and the implements. We used to say, I'm going out to Hunger's land. I'm going to load Wang's cart. I can't really remember when the word hour took over, but it must have been at least a year later. Perhaps more.
The advanced co-op was a socialist project because distribution happened according to labor. Before distribution took place, the co-op paid taxes, and then a portion of gross income was put aside in an accumulation fund for investment purposes. The rest was distributed to team members according to the amount of labor they contributed during the year. So this was 1956. Communes started to emerge in 1958. How did this transition happen in 2 years? The initiative was again taken from the advanced sections of the peasant masses. In 1957, huge numbers of peasants started to engage in large-scale projects like water conservation and forestry. These economic projects were boosted by political campaigns, which heightened class struggle and unleashed new productive forces. In this case, it was the anti-rightist campaign that promoted line struggle and encouraged everybody to contribute to the vision of building socialism. The National Program of Agriculture encouraged peasants working on large-scale projects and established formal policies around water conservation, fertilizer collection, and the establishment of rural industrialization. But there was a little problem. The elementary and advanced co-ops simply couldn't handle the execution of these large projects. Think about it. Each co-op only tended to their own land, but irrigation was a problem that went beyond their own crops. This meant there was a conflict between each co-op's interests. But when they united into a larger political and economic unit, aka the commune, they could all work together on the same plots and could properly allocate water for irrigation. So just like with other projects, the emergence of the communes arose out of a material need. The first People's Commune was established in April 1958 in Hunan and was called the Sputnik Commune. It had 43,000 members. I know, pretty massive, right? Party representatives visited the communes and were impressed by the gains achieved there. The first wave of communes popped up before the party put out any official directive, but just like with the co-ops, once the party officially approved their formation, communes started popping up all over the country. The experience of these communes were then taken as a template for the whole country and instilled in what was called the Beidai-ho resolution, which read, People's communes with all-round management of agriculture, forestry, animal husbandry, side occupations, and fishery, where industry, the worker, agriculture, the peasant, exchange, the trader, culture and education, the student, and military affairs, the militiaman, merge into one, is the fundamental policy to guide the peasants to accelerate socialist construction, complete the building of socialism ahead of time, and carry out the gradual transition of communism. Are y'all hearing this? They were at a point where they had a nationwide political and economic unit that was able to carry out the gradual transition to communism. Now, all these memes on the internet of, what would your job be in the People's Commune? They were actually there. The sizes of these communes differed, with membership averaging around 20 to 25,000 households in the early stages, which then decreased to 8,000 per commune, and ultimately stabilized in the late 1970s between 13,000 and 16,000. So how did they work? There were 3 levels of ownership and management within the communes: the commune, brigade, and the team level. To put it simply, the commune level implemented any huge operation that included, well, the entire commune. Think about stuff like installing electric stations everywhere. That's a high level of logistics and operations to consider. The middle level was the brigade level. This level of ownership contained a smaller range of technology and tools for all teams to use. Think about things like milling stations. I mean, it wouldn't make sense for each team to own their own milling station. This would be a waste of resources. So this was collectively owned on the brigade level. Within the communes, a lot of emphasis was placed on the team level, which is how work was organized. This of course depended on what the communes produced, but the general line was that production had to be infused with a face-to-face working relationship. And instead of being paid a salary, peasants were paid in work points. Each commune decided how many work points each job was worth. And work points weren't only based on the intensity of the job or experience and skill, they are also based on the attitude of workers. In all communes, this distribution was decided in meetings, but the methods and levels of success differed everywhere. For example, someone in a meeting might say they deserve 4 work points, but if the group assesses that this person starts work late and ends early, they might have to concede to 3. Generally, the distribution of work points within teams was fairly equal. The biggest difference was 3-to-1, and the work points were received in grain and cash. Now this cash couldn't be turned into capital, aka peasants couldn't reinvest their savings into profit-making enterprises. Remember, communes were a socialist project, which meant earnings from non-productive work were eliminated, and there were limits on income gaps. There was, however, still a capitalist element left in the communes, which is going to become really important later. You see, team members also had private lots where they planted vegetables and raised chickens and pigs. Now the size of these plots was limited, and they weren't allowed to hire other people to work on their land. But, there was still a capitalist element that the capitalist roaders would be able to exploit. Aside from milling stations, the brigade level owned sewing stations, operated the cafeteria, etc. Starting from the Cultural Revolution, this was also the starting level for industrial units that produced a wide variety of manufacturing products. And when it came to the commune level, it's important to note that the large productive instruments they owned, like irrigation and drainage systems and electric stations, were actually put to use for the benefit of the people. Electric stations were used to free peasants from hard manual labor, like installing irrigation pumps. Technical innovation and make labor easier instead of depriving people from their livelihood? What an idea! The commune system meant that for the first time in thousands of years, most Chinese peasants lived in security. Quota grain took care of their hunger, and with the cash earned from work points, they bought clothes, shoes, towels, soap, hot water bottles, and other funky stuff. Children went to school, and if people got sick, there were barefoot doctors to take care of them. These were people trained to take care of basic medical needs. They took care of the small stuff, while commune and county hospitals took care of the big stuff. And of course, there were more subtler improvements in peasant life that I won't get into here. Now at this point, you might ask yourself, okay, if distribution under socialism is based on labor, what about those who can't work? They were taken care of as well. In China, they called this the 5 guarantees. Regardless of whether you were able to work or not, you were guaranteed food, housing, medical care, care for those in old age, and burial expenses for the dead. And this was especially important for winning over the older generations, who were the most entrenched in feudal ideas. So aside from guaranteeing survival and a basic level of comfort, these more equal social relations then unleashed new productive forces. Who'd have thunk it? You can achieve both at the same time. It was these new social relations that unleashed new productive forces. During winter, when farming was slow, communes built infrastructure like irrigation, drainage system, roads, and did I mention irrigation? A lot of irrigation. They also terraced lands, filled in small creeks with soil, and joined small pieces of land together to prepare for use of agricultural machinery. But of course, because the laws of nature have to be dialectical or whatever, these new successes brought along new dangers. You see, the communes that had lots of fertile land, access to transport and things like that were doing incredibly well. Other communes that had poor soil and were in areas with higher incidences of floods and droughts didn't do too hot. They barely had any surplus left that could be invested in expanding production. This of course meant the gap between communes grew bigger and bigger. Had the party been unified, this problem would have been taken care of. But turns out, this economic problem required a political solution. That solution would be the Cultural Revolution. Why didn't Mao just kill the capitalist roaders? It's funny how he's credited with being this ultimate dictator with supreme powers, yet one of the criticisms we could launch at him is that he was too lenient. Well, keep in mind that Mao was just one of many party members and didn't have ultimate say in who'd be purged and who wouldn't. But even if he did, his philosophy on revisionism wouldn't have led him to taking that kind of action. You see, revisionism stems from class contradictions that are unresolved. So just like you can kill a revolutionary but you can't kill a revolution, you can kill a revisionist but you can't kill revisionism without liquidating the class they stem from. And ultimately, the masses make history and not the party. It's the masses that ultimately have to hold cadres and party members accountable. That goes nationally and even more so on the local level where a lot can slip through the cracks. The communes were established during a large-scale mobilization campaign, also known as the Great Leap Forward. This campaign consisted of many victories but also excesses. The major victories were primary because they fortified the communes and laid the groundwork for large-scale industrialization. But of course the capitalist roaders only focus on the excesses and not on the corrections made afterwards. You see, a lot of the errors during the Great Leap Forward came from something they called the communist wind. This stood for the tendency to move into communism too quickly without any regard for material conditions. For example, for a while the basic accounting units were shifted from the team level to the brigade. Now, this doesn't sound like much, but it was a big step in collectivization. After this shift, county and commune governments started randomly taking resources from production brigades to invest in gigantic irrigation projects. With all this over-focus on industrial and large-scale production, not enough attention was paid to food production, which led to food shortages and starvation. One of the fixes to this problem was shifting the basic accounting units back to the team level. While you should strike while the iron is hot, you don't want to overheat and come out burned. There were plenty of other problems that the communes faced. For example, not all members were empowered to participate in decision-making, and there was an over-reliance on officials. Doesn't sound too mass-liney to me. Mao was of course one of the main party officials supporting this campaign, and with these excesses, the bourgeois faction jumped on the chance to discredit him. Through some clever maneuvers, Mao's influence and power was diminished after the Great Leap Forward. The bourgeois faction was once more gaining the upper hand. Sounds like the time was ripe for a cultural revolution, but not just yet, my friends. There was one last campaign and attempt to mobilize especially cadres and the masses against the revisionists. This campaign was the Socialist Education Movement, and it was pretty weird. Let's take a look at how the bourgeois faction used this atmosphere of confusion after the Great Leap Forward to attack socialist projects. In 1961, Liu Shaoqi said that peasants had gained nothing from the collective economy and that they needed to allow individual farming again. Exactly the line that Deng pushed through in 1978. But anyway, there were plenty of problems with the communes for sure. Remember, this was a time where differences in growth between communes slowly started showing. But to say that the peasants had gained nothing from them was preposterous, and it gets even more ridiculous if you look at the solutions Liu and his faction proposed. Instead of adopting methods that would create more equality, Liu emphasized and pushed for further unequal development. He chose 132 communes that had showed the most return and granted them loans and technological aid. And with help only going to the regions that were performing the best, well, you can guess what happened to the poor areas. Other than that, manufactured goods were to be distributed according to the profit incentive, which meant they first went to urban areas where salaries were high and a lot of money circulated, and only then to the more wealthy rural counties. Of course, class struggle is nothing without a little bit of sabotage, and plenty of techniques were used to discredit communes. One example is how tractors and farm machinery that were sold to the communes were removed, and then the money spent on them wasn't refunded. This of course gave the peasants plenty of reason to be pissed off at the commune system. Mao's line was for collectivization to lead to rural mechanization and industrialization. In other words, for an improvement in social relations to lead to an improvement in productive forces. For someone like Liu Shaoqi to focus so much on productive forces, but then to remove tractors, one almost begins to question his motives. And remember the 4 freedoms during China's capitalist era from 1952 to 56? Well, of course they couldn't just bring this back with the communes now being a thing and all. Instead, the 4 freedoms were turned into 3 guarantees and 1 reward. This was officialized in the 60 regulations for agriculture. These focused on the only capitalist elements remaining, private plots. For the revisionist faction, the rule was easy. The bigger, the better. Private plots were expanded from 5% of the land to 15% and later 20%. Other fun little changes included small enterprises becoming responsible for their own profits and losses again. This opened up black markets and also bankrupted a lot of small businesses. Good stuff, good stuff. To sum it up, the 3 guarantees were to promote free markets, to enlarge private plots, for each individual household to be responsible for its own profit or loss. The 1 reward, or 1 contract, was to have each individual household sign a contract with the state for the production of a preset amount of crops. After the preset amount was met, the peasants would be free to sell the rest on the market. And remember how amazing the Grain Purchasing Act was in ending the rich peasant economy? Well, the move to roll it back was just as cunning, but things got even more vicious. In November 1963, they set up the Agricultural Bank to help starve out small industrial enterprises. Communes in turn were forbidden to open or run any new enterprises. The power to organize labor was diminished, and so forth. Output quota shifted back to individual households, which was a huge blow to the commune system. The shift back to the family unit had a negative impact on women and children, as people fell back into old ways. With this return to old family dynamics, women were once again in charge of housework and children were withdrawn from schools and put back to work, especially girls. And to top it off, the construction of new schools ended. These dynamics were further pushed by the capitalist roaders. In 1962, Liu Shaoqi went to Chufu, birthplace of Confucius, and paid respects. According to Confucian ideology, women aren't even fully worthy human beings. The message was clear. There was also a dismantling of the red and expert strategy. This strategy came from a fundamental question reeling back to the Yenan era of the People's War. How do you deal with the need for professionals in a society without having them succumb to petty bourgeois ideology? You train people ideologically to be red and technically to be expert. But not any longer. The motto became expert rather than red. And this switch up ran deep. Control of areas and communes changed from party leaders to managerial staff. Education was also becoming depoliticized, and there was an emphasis on technical excellence alone. All of these, of course, were huge blowbacks to the revolution. The intensity and necessity for the Cultural Revolution becomes even more understandable in this context. So did cadres and peasants just take this? Well, remember, all of this takes place during the socialist education movement. This was headed by Liu and Wang Guangmei, the revisionist power couple, who did their best to sow their own form of chaos and confusion during this era. Mao and Zhou Enlai, who was the country's vice chairman amongst other positions, had stated that the center must take full responsibility for errors. Mao as well had self-criticized for the excesses of the Great Leap Forward. Upon further inspection, Zhou's role in this campaign and era gets a little tricky, but, that would sidetrack us too much. What's important here is that the rectification campaign started by Liu shifted the blame from the center to lower cadres. This further gave off the impression that the party was untouchable, another reason why the Cultural Revolution makes sense as a reaction to the sentiment. While Mao wanted to rectify the party at all levels, Liu focused only on the grassroots level, and instead of promoting line struggle within organizations, outside work teams were sent in to propagate socialist ideas and replace local leadership. This tactic was especially fruitful because a lot of communes were rejecting Liu's policies. So these work teams then terrorized local leadership, spread slander and false accusations, driving cadres to inactivity, depression, and in some cases suicide. The work teams were helped by former rich and upper middle peasants, and throughout this campaign, once more their influence increased. It should come as no surprise that cadres became resentful. 9 cadres in Pawan County from Sinway Production Brigade wrote that since rules and regulations were constantly changing, they had better do nothing and thus never be wrong. The revolution was in crisis. The proletarian faction looked at this and went, we've launched a lot of campaigns to combat revisionism. Like, a lot. Campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, 3 antis, 5 antis, Su Fun movement, 100 Flowers Bloom campaign, Great Leap Forward, Socialist Education movement, and so on. And although the masses and the revolution had made great leaps, it also seemed that as the country progressed, revisionism was also growing stronger. What did all these campaigns have in common? They were all initiated by the party and regulated by the party itself. But if the party had started to become more and more dominated by revisionism, then, well, would you trust a revisionist to weed out revisionism? What happened next would mark a leap in revolutionary theory and practice. A new campaign was needed that would go beyond the regular party channels, and it had to happen on a nationwide scale. The masses needed to lead it themselves. That was the incredible advancement of the Cultural Revolution, a new stage in the dialectical relationship between the party and the masses. Before the Cultural Revolution, the party was infallible. No one dared to touch it. So when Mao came out with his Datsubao, big character poster that read "Bombard the headquarters," the message was clear. Listen y'all, these revisionists we've been trying to combat, they've been under your noses this whole time. The party at no point was a monolith or a unified bloc that followed the same political line. Class struggle continues under socialism and within the party. Time to root out revisionism and lead the revolution to full victory. The Cultural Revolution was wild. The first 2 years were characterized by power seizures from different sides and complicated shifting alliances between factions that were sometimes based on genuine line differences and sometimes not. The super simplistic version is that these power seizures were mainly in favor of the proletarian faction, which led them to being able to push socialist projects further for 10 more years. Many of the most progressive elements that we see as characteristic for the Chinese Revolution were only implemented wide-scale during the Cultural Revolution, so only during the last 10 years of its socialist era. It's one of the reasons why Maoists uphold it so much. The Cultural Revolution was different than any other campaign in the past. As we've seen, national campaigns were often based on one local advance initiative. But in this case, initiatives sprung up everywhere. Mass organizations sprouted up all over the Chinese countryside. It might surprise you that before, the only mass orgs peasants had access to were the Communist Youth League and the militia. Both were controlled by village party branches, and you just had to be lucky to have a village party branch with a proletarian outlook. These newly sprouted mass organizations also went further than previous projects because they cut across clan and family lines. You know, there's a lot of tear-jerking stories about how the Cultural Revolution tore apart families, but in a lot of cases, it was simply a division in political line, like with any society. The difference in line mainly centered around whether to overthrow the current local party members or not. This meant in actuality that the peasants were discussing what the correct path to socialism was. They'd come a long way since 1949 if you ask me. They'd finally had a taste of the masses truly being in control, as well as a taste of how truly in danger socialism was. Without these seizures of power, the reforms that eventually took place starting from 78 would have already been thoroughly implemented in the 60s. Which made sense because before this campaign, there was really no good way for the masses to speak out against village party authorities. So the fact that this only happened so late in the Chinese Revolution is a lesson for all of us. With these changes, there came a greater awareness of the contradiction between those who lead and those who are led, as well as the contradiction between mental and manual labor. There were massive discussions on how to abolish both these contradictions. Before the Cultural Revolution, production team leaders were appointed by village leaders, and village leaders were in turn chosen by commune leaders. This meant that ordinary peasants didn't have as much say in the process. That's not to say that it was undemocratic, but that there were limitations that still had to be overcome. After the Cultural Revolution, team leaders were elected by team members. This was a great push for further political equality. The same went for village leaders, and if peasants were dissatisfied, they could now appeal to the commune to replace the party chief. One of the reasons why production started increasing after the power seizures was because peasants started to have way more input. There were mass meetings in early spring to discuss the production goals and plans of the year. These could include 10,000 people from county leaders to production team leaders. After that, you had a forum in which villagers shared information and aspirations with each other and exchanged better farming practices and methods. Again, we have to emphasize what a shift this marked in the revolution. During the Great Leap Forward, for example, production decisions were handed down by higher level authorities. Provincial leaders decided the production quotas and development projects for counties, and county leaders told the commune leaders what they were expected to do. There wasn't as much back and forth. But now when peasants didn't want to carry out a particular central policy, no one could force them to. There were tons of cases in which peasants straight up kicked out cadres. When you have cadres pushing for a capitalist line, that can mean the difference between life and death for the revolution. Remember how Liu Shaoqi had pulled back tractors and was allowing only the richest and best communes to use machinery? Well, after the power seizures, farm machinery became available again on a wide scale. Not only that, but communes were allowed to start up new industries again. This not only increased production, but also made the bond stronger between the working class and the peasantry. Agriculture nourished the industrial enterprises by providing them with raw materials. Industrial enterprises in turn helped agriculture develop by producing machines that made farming easier. And due to educational reforms, local industries now had educated youth who, instead of staying in the cities, went back to their hometowns to help and were able to provide technical know-how because, guess what? They actually learned how to operate machines while in school. Again, a way in which the wall between mental and manual labor was being broken down. Now, of course, this paints a very general picture. What about the communes in poverty who had poor soil and lack of access to transportation? Well, think about the massive amount of poverty China was dealing with at the start of the revolution. It'd be impossible for every area to become rich in just 20 years, so it makes sense that there were still poor communes. Their grain production was either barely enough or nearly not enough to feed everyone, so after meeting the quota grain production, there was no surplus to reinvest in industries or large-scale agricultural projects, thus trapping them in a cycle of further poverty. For peasants in these communes, enlarging the private plot seemed attractive because they were like, okay, if I can make more from working on my private plot than from work points in the commune, then why shouldn't I just work on my private plot more? This was double the case for strong members in these communes who weren't awarded accordingly for the work they did. This was obviously a problem that had to be overcome. But this actually wasn't as much a danger for the revolution as the other side of the coin. You see, a lot of communes were actually doing really well. So well that new contradictions arose, and it was these new contradictions that would lead them to find capitalist reforms attractive. Let's break it down. The communes that initially did better were the ones next to major highways, railways, and had good soil. There were plenty of exceptions of communes that overcame poor material conditions by putting politics in command and transforming their areas, like Dajai, but we don't have time to get into that right now. The communes that were doing well by the late 1960s were able to invest their surpluses from agricultural production into manufacturing industries, and by the mid-1970s, when the Cultural Revolution was deep into its stagnation, these rural industries were doing really well. This meant more surplus to reinvest. If there'd been no limitations to capital accumulation, then the communes would have been able to reinvest all their surplus into increasing production and eventually buying out the smaller communes. But since China was still socialist, there were state restrictions on capital accumulation. Brigades and communes had to set aside 1/3 of profit for agricultural development and another portion for welfare development before they could invest their profit in industries. Now, if all you care about is capital accumulation, then that's a pretty significant barrier. This is the harsh reality of equal development. Some sections are gonna have to grow slower so others don't fall behind. But it's also like the whole point of getting from socialism to communism? You know, full equality everywhere? Aside from a limit on accumulation, rural industries also couldn't compete with state industries in acquiring raw materials or selling products. There was no such thing as free competition. If there was, then all the communes would have neglected agriculture because the return of investment on industries was much higher than agriculture, which would lead to, starvation. We already had a hint of that in the Great Leap Forward and wouldn't want that to happen again. So the communes that were doing well in increasing production were distributing higher income to their households. Now this part is really crucial as well. Even though peasants were able to put aside a lot of money, they weren't allowed to personally reinvest it, since that'd be, capitalism. Had they been able to reinvest their savings into capital, a few of them would have come out as very successful capitalists, and you'd get, contemporary China. So in order for the revolution to be successful, entire communes constantly had to be convinced to sacrifice their own interests for the sake of the whole country. This paints a different picture of the Maoist era than the stereotypical one of extreme poverty and hunger, and that this was hailed as some moral good, that hunger meant dedication to the revolution because, hey, we don't care about productive forces, just some type of revolutionary purity. But these contradictions, like the ones between well-off communes and poorer communes, actually arose out of the expansion of productive forces, not their minimization. The main question didn't become how do we expand productive forces, but how do we do so on an equal basis over the whole country. It's here that we see the superstructure becoming primary over the base, because to continue the revolution, the people needed to be persuaded to sacrifice some of their wealth to benefit the whole nation. This wasn't a problem of economics, but of ideology, of cultural consciousness, of the superstructure. Now, had the socialist era not ended with the defeat of the Cultural Revolution, here's how I might have continued the story. Through a new campaign, the proletarian faction won out over the capitalist faction, which created the space to implement new policies. Instead of going back to the 3 freedoms and 1 contract, the revolution continued and deepened even further. Certain steps like breaking down factories in Shanghai and transporting them to poorer areas in the West continued. With the advances made nationally in industrialization, the state then reduced agricultural taxes and reduced prices of industrial products even further. prices of consumer goods that peasants paid declined more as well. This opened up space for further mechanization of agriculture in all communes. As this developed, the accounting unit was raised from the team to the brigade. And with the brigades in turn owning more agricultural machinery for all the teams to use, it made more sense for the team to give up their smaller accounting units. So instead of going back to the family as an accounting unit, it actually developed to a higher brigade level. And through mechanization, productivity increased, which meant that each work point increased in value. Slowly but surely, peasants completely lost interest in the 3 freedoms and 1 contract scheme. This, of course, is an oversimplification that would contain multiple huge transformations. But what I'm trying to impart on you is that what happened after 1976 wasn't some inevitable outcome. There were many different roads that lay ahead of China, and what happened was no less than the defeat of the revolution. Mao had issued directives to extend the Cultural Revolution to agriculture as early as December 1966. The call was for peasants to grasp revolution and promote production, to resist landlords and counter-revolutionaries. The goals were for the peasants to seize power and for the struggle to develop them ideologically. For the first time in any campaign, the main targets were capitalist voters in the party. A distinction was made between the party as an institution and party bosses as individuals. This was important because previously party members had gotten away with stuff by using party leadership as a shield against criticism. The capitalist voters had the strongest backing through the remnants of landowners. While they only made up 2 to 3% of China, that's still 20 million people. So who are these capitalist voters? They seem so mysterious, like a paranoia dream. According to estimates by William Hinton, at the start of the Cultural Revolution, capitalist voters made up at least 2/3 of the Politburo, 1/2 of the CC, they led all regional bureaus, held 3/4 of the provincial governorships, headed 3/4 of the provincial party committees. So when we say Mao was a minority within the party, we're serious. Let's make it even more concrete by naming names. President of the Republic, Liu Shaoqi. Secretary General of Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping. Chief of Staff of the Army, Luo Juiqing. The man who replaced him, Yang Chengwu. Marshal Ho Lung. Head of All China Sports Commission, Lu Tingyi. Zhou Yang, Deputy Head of Propaganda Department. Vice Premier, Tan Chenlin. Head of Agricultural Work under the State Council. Bo Yibo, Head of the State Planning Commission. Mayor of Beijing, Peng Zhen. Mayor of Shanghai, Tsupti Chou. And Liu Ping, President of Beijing University. So these were university presidents, factory directors, commune chairmen. Think about it. You had communes that did really well that would be able to expand quicker by taking the capitalist road, headed by capitalist voters. And before the Cultural Revolution, the masses had limited means of voicing their complaints or taking their own political stand. This is why the Cultural Revolution blew a last bit of life into the revolution and extended it for 10 more years. Now what makes all of this worse is that a lot of these capitalist voters didn't just hold one position. For example, Liu Shaoqi wasn't only the president of the Republic, but had long led the organization department of the Communist Party, which placed key supporters in party posts all over the country. Which of course explains why there were so many capitalist voters everywhere. This also meant that the bourgeois headquarters moved quicker than the proletarian one during the Cultural Revolution. After all, it was easier for the revisionists to create a movement around themselves since they were already in power. So what about the proletarian faction? It should come as no surprise that it had the support of lower levels of party members and the most oppressed sections of the masses. The faction consisted of 1/4 of the provincial governors, many deputy governors, many leading political officers, and deputy political officers in the army. Tens of thousands of middle-level cadre, civilian and military, rank and file of the army, millions of students, tens of millions of workers, and hundreds of millions of peasants. So why was the Cultural Revolution defeated? This is something Maoists are still studying and analyzing. But one thing to keep in mind is that for a revolution to be successful, there needs to be a proletarian faction with a clear proletarian line exposing the bourgeois faction and the bourgeois line. In the case of China, the bourgeois headquarters was already too deeply entrenched in the party. The 10-year experience of the Cultural Revolution proves that as long as the proletarian faction can still guide the revolution, you will have a deepening of socialism, and so a blooming of communism. But when this proletarian faction loses out and is defeated, as what happened after Mao's death, then there's only so much that the masses can do. A whole new revolution was needed at this point, but as we know, a revolution requires a vanguard. The Cultural Revolution wouldn't have been successful without the proletarian faction calling for it and sustaining it. The same goes for any previous campaigns, which was based on the actions of the masses but guided by the party. The masses make history, the party guides it. With the defeat of the Cultural Revolution, many people who supported socialist projects were imprisoned and disappeared. The full story of the revisionist turn the revolution took is for a different time. But good thing for us, class struggle doesn't stop until class society ends. What happens next is up to the Chinese masses. But one thing's for sure, their socialist period needs to be studied and taken seriously. Any socialist period can be judged by the initiatives of the advanced sections of the masses and the class struggle within the party. What's the proletarian line? What's the bourgeois line? And what is the context in which these two are fighting it out? We have to start from the facts and not from our desires. And in a world where it's hard to find revolutionary optimism, that becomes even more important. Just want to give a big shout out to all my patrons for helping support the channel. A really great way to support me is by streaming my music on all streaming platforms under the name Space Baby. Thank you so much for watching. Space Baby out.